Welcome once again to St. Mary's Chester Talks About Race. This week, we complete our series on the history of systemic racism in America and the criminal justice system. Since the abolishment of slavery, criminalization laws continue to plague Black and brown communities. Our presentation this week will look at the various ways African Americans and other people of color continue to be faced with the unequal application of those laws.
Between emancipation and 1874, this is a period of a great deal of violence, uncertainty, and conflict in the South. There's no other way to describe. We call it the Reconstruction era. But really, at a local level, this is all about conflicts over independence and equality between blacks and whites. And the legal system plays an important role in this. The black codes were taken from the old slave codes, and these were laws that were meant to apply solely to black people. And they were laws that made it a crime, again, to be out after a certain hour, for possessing a weapon of any kind. Vagrancy was one. Let's say you had a skill as a slave. You wanted to be a barber, or you wanted to have your own shop, or even if a black woman wanted to be a laundress, you had to have a permit, and you had to pay money to get that permit. And if you were operating without a permit, you could be arrested under the black codes. These laws varied from state to state, but they all had the same purpose, which was to subject the freed people to their own particular kinds of control. You have people being arrested on charges from the black codes and put to work on the streets. And this is before the big convict leasing system emerges. These are all local laws. If you're arrested for vagrancy, if you're arrested for theft, if you're arrested for larceny, these are tried in local courts. These are not tried in federal courts. These are tried in local courts. There is actually very little that the federal government can do to intervene in these kinds of situations. That this was really a tool that was used to keep blacks in fear and also to curtail their independence. It's very common in newspapers, local county newspapers, for the press to describe who's in the local jail. And they'll say 73 in the Dallas County Jail, all Negro. So many people arrested for theft, all Negro. Now, these were meant to convey an idea that former slaves were inherently criminal, but what they really show is that whites didn't have to worry about the power of the law when it came to their behavior. It's inevitable that the combination of the legacy of slavery and the power placed in the hands of whites, these laws are going to be disproportionately used against black people, and they were.
Across the South after the Reconstruction period, state legislatures also focused on one of the most innovative solutions to the problem of black freedom in this period. That is that they focused on changing criminal statutes for the purposes of widening the net to allow for greater discretion in policing black behavior. White Southerners were absolutely horrified and outraged by the reality that people they had once owned were now their equals. The plain and simple fact was that for them, the world had literally been turned upside down. And in every way possible, they attempted to turn that world right side up again. That is, to put it back to what it had once been. One of the most infamous set of laws to come out of this period were the Pig Laws. And the Pig Laws passed in Mississippi, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, focused on enhancing penalties for what had once been a misdemeanor now becomes a felony. And in a sense, the simple taking of livestock, and I put quotes around taking because in many of these cases, African Americans were entitled to the very fruits of their labor that they were being cheated out of. But when they defiantly claimed those things, which could be pigs, could be chickens, could be the instruments of the field, the hoe, a plow, as something as their own, they were subject to felony offenses now. And those felony offenses gave far more leverage over landowners to threaten prosecution if African Americans did not give back or concede to their demands. And so across the South, we see gradually in the 1870s a growing population of prisoners in southern states. And one indice of that was in the state of Alabama, for example, in the 1850s, 99% of the state's prisoners were white. By the 1870s, 85% of Alabama's prisoners are black. And so overnight, literally in historical time, we see a tremendous explosion of incarceration of African Americans.
But even after African Americans began to be a part of the political process, the state legislatures of the South passed more and more and more restrictive measures which were effectively designed to criminalize black life, to make it essentially impossible for any African American man who didn't live under the explicit protection of some white landowner to not be in violation of some law at almost all times. And the kinds of things we're talking about are absurd to modern ears, but it was a crime in the South for a farm worker to walk beside a railroad. It was a crime in the South to speak loudly in the company of white women. It was a crime to sell the products of your farm after dark, almost anywhere in the South. There were reasons, there were sort of odd logics behind almost all of these laws, and none of them said that they applied exclusively to African Americans. But overwhelmingly, they were only ever enforced against African Americans because the explicit intent, when I say the intent was explicit, it was. In the Constitutional Convention of Alabama in 1901, when a new constitution was passed, which effectively ended all black participation in political life and public life in Alabama, the discussions around the drafting of these laws were very open about the intention to make it impossible for black men to participate in mainstream American life in any meaningful way. But the most powerful, the most damaging of all of these laws were the vagrancy statutes, where in every southern state it became a crime, or you became a criminal, if you could not prove at any given moment that you were employed. What white Southerners then discovered was that this was also an extraordinarily effective way of intimidating African Americans away from the new civil rights they had obtained as a result of the 13th Amendment and the end of the Civil War. These laws passed to force them back into labor also intimidated them away from the political process, or could be used to intimidate them away from the political process. And so by the end of the 19th century, on the basis of these two strategies of white Southerners, enormous populations of African Americans had been returned to a state of de facto slavery and had been effectively pushed completely, entirely out of the political process, and they would not return for 6 decades.
In the Constitution, the 13th Amendment states, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction." Although this amendment is said to have abolished slavery, mass incarceration serves as a form of institutionalized slavery.
The 13th Amendment also states that slavery shall be abolished except in cases where a person has been duly convicted of a crime. So the 13th Amendment actually has paved the way to create a whole nother level of slavery that was basically, and still is, sponsored by, of course, the United States government and sanctioned by the United States government.
Before we talk about what institutionalized slavery looks like today, it's important that we understand its origin and how it manifested itself. So what was life like for African Americans after slavery was, quote-unquote, abolished?
Life for African Americans after the abolition of slavery was brutal. There were several things that were in place that made freedom a really dim prospect for African Americans. Freedom itself was provisional. So you had a situation where you had free blacks, but then you have blacks with no voting rights. But without voting rights, then what's to stop an embittered South that had just recently lost the war to begin to regain power and then reenact their power in a form of terrorism against black folk. Okay? And they did that.
The Jim Crow laws emerged towards the end of Reconstruction in 1877 as a way to keep African Americans socially, economically, and racially inferior to white Americans.
Jim Crow was a term that was used for a system of laws that was separate but equal. In other words, you could, because African Americans had civil rights that had been given to them under the Constitution and under Civil Rights Acts, to do away with Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws were saying that you could have separate but equal facilities. And as a result, you used to see signs that for colored only or for whites only. You'd have restaurants that had segregated eating facilities. That happened on bus transportation and mass transportation, trains and things of that nature. That resulted in separate but equal facilities being given to people, but they weren't really equal.
Many Africans were not allowed to use their rights. They were terrorized from using their rights. And certainly this created, or perpetuated, I should say, a huge wedge in between African Americans and white citizens. And it really did damage to both groups because it gives white people the delusion that they were superior. And certainly many Africans, because of the power structure was in the hands of those racist whites, many Africans internalized those beliefs. So I believe it was Carter G. Woodson who said, when you control a man's thinking, you don't have to worry about his actions. You don't have to tell him to go to the back of the bus. He will go there automatically as a matter of course.
Shortly after Jim Crow, chain gangs emerged in the 1890s. Prisoners were chained together and subject to physically challenging work as a form of punishment.
If you were convicted of some kind of crime, and that crime could be as insignificant as an insulting gesture toward a white person, you could be convicted for that crime, taken to prison for life, and then made to work in a chain gang and essentially be re-enslaved with no pay. And once you got into the prison, what they could essentially do to you is not only force you to work in slave labor, but hire you out to corporations. You're not paid for it, and these corporations essentially are given the gift of free labor.
The U.S. has the highest incarceration rate in the world, having about 2.3 million people in jail at any given time, and majority of the people in jail have not been convicted of a crime. The percent of people incarcerated rose 500% from 1980 to 2014. As you may notice, mass incarceration is a huge problem in the African American community. The three-strike law, implemented on March of 1994, was supposed to crack down on big-time drug offenders, but led to people who committed smaller crimes to serve possibly lifelong sentences. This severely impacted the African American community because more police targeted them by focusing more on urban areas than suburban areas.
What they were attempting to do with the three strikes was, federally, if you had violated laws and you reached the third strike, you would then be asked, or you would then be put in prison for the rest of your life. So if there was a first offense was something serious as a felony like a burglary, and then you committed a second offense that was also a felony, let's say that was something like a robbery, maybe a nonviolent robbery. That third offense, as something as minor as a drug or retail theft, could then qualify you for the three-strike rule, where you would no longer be eligible for probation or parole within the criminal justice systems.
So the criminal justice system has injustices in it that need to be repaired, because it doesn't make sense for all these young people of African American descent who are in jail. Something's wrong.
I would say mostly it affects minority populations, and we really need to review the criminal justice system to be sure that more things are focused on rehabilitation rather than on punishment per se.
Far too many cases, the punishment simply does not fit the crime. If you're a low-level drug dealer or you violate your parole, you owe some debt to society. You have to be held accountable and make amends. But you don't owe 20 years. You don't owe a life sentence.
thank you once again for joining us on St. Mary's Chester Talks About Race.